I'm Derek Heck. I'm a third-year graduate student in the Center for Urban Education at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, and I am delighted to welcome you to CUESEF 2019. We have, with a team of partners and friends of the center, have been working on putting together for you what we hope is a soul-stirring, substantive 3 days of challenging our assumptions about what it means to be and do education. When we consider our theme, dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline, reimagining policies, practices, and politics in educational systems, I think what that begs us to do is ask ourselves a few questions. We have to first acknowledge that there is a school-to-prison pipeline. We have to ask ourselves what roles we play in this pipeline. We have to ask ourselves what will we do and what are we committed to doing to dismantling this pipeline. I think when you come to a conference like this, when you come to a series like this, you come because there are things you anticipate getting from the opportunity. Some are here because they returned, some are here because their places of employment have encouraged them to go, and some are just wondering what the hype is about CUESEF. However, I ask you this morning to question what you brought to the table. With what spirit did you come into this place? With what intentions did you come into this place? How do you intend to participate? How do you intend to grow? And I'll ask you to look around your tables. There are questions that you have, and answers are not always going to be internal. They may be sitting next to you. They may be rooted in the dialogue that we have. It may be in the challenge that someone brings to you. You may leave affirmed in your footing and what you've already come to know, but you may leave challenged to reconsider and reimagine. And if one does challenge you to reconsider, I ask that you do it in love, do it in humanity, and do it with the hope that tomorrow's outcome includes the person sitting next to you. And I'll say this, we can be one of two people as we dismantle this pipeline. We could be either in the way or on the way. And there are certain people in the room that have determined that even if you are in the way, we're still on our way. And the goal for CUESEF is to make certain that we did not just come to listen and chat and chew and talk, but we came with an outcome that is going to impact what happens tomorrow and the next day and beyond, because people are literally dying because of what somebody has imagined about them. People are literally being undereducated, if at all, because of what somebody has imagined about them. So let's consider ourselves getting ready to imagine the best of each other in this space, imagine the best of these next 3 days, and imagine what the world will look like if we, brick by brick, do this thing together. And so I welcome you, and I encourage you to be a full participant, a present participant. I invite you to wonder. I invite you to hope. I imagine that you will be inspired by not only what you hear from our panelists, but from what you learn from each other, because there is a symbiotic relationship that will happen. We will learn and grow with each other. So those are my opening remarks, and I want to now bring forward our dean. Our dean, Dr. Valerie Kinloch, has written a gracious letter in our booklet here, and I do invite you to read her remarks. But before I ask her to come, so that we keep on time, I want to just say the type of dean that Dean Kinloch is. Dean Kinloch is student-centered, student-focused, outcomes-driven, and collaborative. She wants to encourage us to do the work together, but she encourages us to dig deeply together. And that sometimes brings discomfort. In the tension between administrative services and roles and a world that's asking for people to be bold and innovative, Dean Kinloch sits in that space with such a tremendous amount of power, ability, grace, and fortitude. And I and all around are looking at the example that she gives and encouraged by the push forward. particularly as she equips us to do the work and not just talk about it. So please, let's have Dean Kinloch come forward and give her a round of applause.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to stand before you and to be the Renee and Richard Goldman Dean of our School of Education here at the University of Pittsburgh. I had a meeting this week, and I paused for a second to share with my senior leaders in the school that on July 1st of 2019, I entered year 3 of this position. And it feels sometimes as if it's been 10 years, just because of all the stuff that you have to do, but then it feels like it's only been 2.5 years. And I say that because the community of scholars and practitioners, of teachers, of researchers, of students, faculty, staff, external partners to the School of Education, internal partners, it has been amazing. And I am excitedly standing before you as your dean, but also, as Derek said, as Valerie, as someone who cares deeply about equity and justice in this world. Someone who will talk about education, but really push us to think deeply and compassionately about learning, about how are we a community with each other, and how do we address inequities, oppressions, injustices, and racism in this world by taking a look at what we do and taking a look at what we should be doing better. And I want to say that it's exciting to be in the School of Education for various reasons. I want you to indulge me for a second. And I want to take you back to the end of my first year as dean of our school. And at the end of our first year, we were in deep conversations about strategic planning, asking ourselves questions about what is the work and what's the work about? How should we be committed, and not just internally, but externally, visibly so, publicly so, to the work that we say we should be doing? And then how do we ask ourselves some hard questions about the work we should be doing that, if we're honest with ourselves, we might not yet be doing? And so I want to read to you our new mission vision statement, because I think some people have said to me it's a little too bold and aggressive. And I have responded, and it's not bold enough. And it's a place to start thinking compassionately with each other about what it is that we need to do in the world. So I want to read this to you, but I have to first pause and say, I see so many wonderful people in the room that I cannot get around to. I see Dave Stovall from Chicago sitting here. James Earl Davis. You know what? Elon, Dancy, can you stand up? Just stand up. So I have to say that one of the really good things, keep on standing, keep on standing. One of the important things that I did was to hire Elon Dancy as our new director of the Center for Urban Education and the Helen S. Faison Endowed Professor of Urban Education in the School of Ed. And it was one of a few hires that I did my first year. And I will say that it is probably one of my best hires, because we are here, and you're going to hear Michelle Alexander later today, and it is because of your work and your commitment to not just urban education, but to education across the lifespan. So I want us to recognize and honor Elon Dancy. Thank you. All right, so our new mission vision statement reads, we ignite learning. We strive for well-being for all. We teach. We commit to student, family, and community success. We commit to educational equity. We advocate. We work for justice. We cultivate relationships. We forge engaged partnerships. We collaborate. We learn with and from communities. We innovate. We agitate. We pursue and produce knowledge. We research. We disrupt and transform inequitable educational structures. We research. We approach learning as intertwined with health, wellness, and human development. We address how national, global, social, and technological change impacts learning. We shape practice and policy. We teach with and for dignity. We think, we dream, we lead with integrity. We are the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And with that mission vision, I ask all faculty and staff and students in our School of Education, if you are present, please stand and be acknowledged. And finally, this is the work. This is the work that we are meant to do in the world. And we do this work with brave colleagues, with brave students, with brave internal and external partners. And so as your Dean of the School of Education, it is my honor to be here. It is my honor to welcome you to our Summer Educators Forum. And it is my honor to say that the work has begun. And if anyone wants to know what's the hype about the Center for Urban Education and CUESEF, I mean, look at us. That's a drop the mic. Thank you.
I always love hearing from our mic-dropping dean. So as part of the mission statement that you heard, Dean Kinloch talked about collaborations. And for those of you who are from Pittsburgh or have any knowledge of Pittsburgh's history, you know that Pittsburgh is really considered to be the birthplace of philanthropy. It's one of the places where great fortunes of the world were shifted to think about and consider what might be done in communities. And one of those organizations is the Heinz Endowments. And the Heinz Endowments is local, but the impact of their work is international. What they are able to do and what they are encouraging people to do is to think about what happens not when money is gifted, but what happens when economic energy is partnered with energy in the community. That's a different way to look at philanthropy. There is the giver and the recipient, or there are entities coming together to realize that together they can be more powerful than they would be apart. And I think that's the spirit of the Heinz Endowments. It's been the spirit of those persons with whom I've been able to work over the past years, and they're under the leadership of Mr. Grant Oliphant. Please come and bring greetings. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. I am so inspired, actually, by Valerie and Derek that what I really want to say is just amen and sit down. And I'm really jazzed to see all of you here today. It's, having worked on this issue for a while now, it feels so good to be in a room full of people who are passionate about it and intent on changing the world. And I just want to say a few words about that because my colleague Carmen Anderson has told me I have a job to do up here, which is to convey a few points. So if you'll bear with me, I will do that in framing what you're about to dive into today. For more than 30 years, we have been led to believe that school violence is more prevalent in this country than it really is. Schools across the nation have adopted zero-tolerance policies that require mandatory consequences, frequently requiring suspensions and expulsions for violations without consideration of the actual severity or threat to safety of the behaviors. These policies suggest that schools would become safer and the needs of students would be better served, and it is an incredibly harmful and damaging myth. The issue with the implementation of these policies and practices has been the unintended consequence of school push-out. Usually I hate jargony phrases like that, but this one really grabs me, the idea that we push kids out. Students with low-risk infractions who should be in their classrooms are introduced instead to the juvenile justice system for behaviors that, depending on where that student attends school or who the student is, are considered for most children typical adolescent activity. The chain of events that contribute to push out have long-term negative consequences, including the increased likelihood of subsequent criminality, particularly for youth who are disadvantaged, youth of color, and youth with disabilities. We we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. The National Research Council at the National Academies tells us that the legal responses to juvenile offending should be grounded in emerging knowledge about adolescent behavior, about how children actually develop, and tailored to an individual offender's needs and social environment. That is what the research tells us and what we know. We are learning more from science about brain development, including that the adolescent brain is still immature, still forming, resulting in youth being less capable of regulating their behavior, more sensitive to external influences such as peer pressure, and that they are less capable of making decisions that require a future orientation. And yet, we want to treat them as though adults. This research has implications for not only how we address policies and practices in schools, but additionally, it should influence how we consider redesign for youth engaged in the justice system, encouraging accountability for offenders through restorative practices, community service, and other opportunities that help youth take responsibility for their actions and grow from them. We also have an opportunity to invest in more appropriate school and community behavioral health services to address the needs of many students without law enforcement involvement. The Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education found that students with disabilities, students with individualized education plans, are twice as likely to experience an out-of-school suspension as students without disabilities. According to the Center of Civil Rights Remedies and the Vera Institute, the economic costs of this behavior on the part of adults are staggering, estimated in the billions. These are resources that could be invested instead by a society that genuinely cared about children in education, in community supports and health, and in wellness services, if we choose to increase diversion and prevention services for youth rather than to invest in punishment. It is a choice. It is a choice. And ultimately, our goal should focus on prevention, reducing the risk of reoffending, treating youth fairly, and restoring them to participate fully as successful students in their schools and as contributing members of their communities. Today, you will be hearing from national and local experts who have researched and understand what is commonly called the school-to-prison pipeline. You will hear about historical perspectives designed to increase your understanding of the evolution of that pipeline, what the policies and practices are that actively drive it every day, who is impacted and why, and most importantly, what alternative policies and practices are. You will also hear from researchers who conducted local research with the Heinz Endowment's support on the magnitude of the issue here in our Pittsburgh region. You will have opportunity to see the importance of having and using disaggregated data as a tool that helps us understand disparate treatment and its impact on students. We know that one important first step is building positive school climates that serve as the foundation for promoting safety, preventing the need for harsh disciplinary practices, and building a supportive academic environment where every single one, all students can flourish. We believe that you are interested in this work just simply by the testimony of your being in this room, by choosing to participate in this important convening, and that's why I'm so jazzed by the presence of everyone here today. The good news is that all across the country, education leaders, policymakers, advocates, and families are leading change. There are school-based models that are working. There are policies and practices that are changing the landscape and the future for our children. We must first challenge the narrative around our children of what practices and policies negatively impact them and what promising alternatives are. If we as leaders begin the dialogue, we can also initiate a strategic process to chart a different course for students, using approaches proven effective to reducing suspension, expulsions, and the pipeline trajectory while increasing safety and graduation rates. The Heinz Endowments is committed to improving the lives of people who are impacted by the judicial system. we have created a major initiative that we call the Restoration Project to promote criminal justice reform in Allegheny County and in the county's adult and juvenile justice systems, and to increase community engagement and support. We are working to reduce the use of the Allegheny County Jail and Schumann Juvenile Detention Center and improve conditions for those confined specifically related to health, with an emphasis on substance use, mental health, and safety needs. We believe that the endowments and that all of us can play a role in bringing stakeholders together in the goal of decreasing the jail population, expanding opportunities for mental health and substance abuse treatment, and drastically reducing the number of youth removed from their classrooms by providing opportunities for early intervention and addressing policy and education code. We also can work toward restoring viable options for formerly incarcerated people, particularly youth and young adults, to return as contributing members in their families, schools, jobs, and communities, prepared to pursue opportunities to live healthy and productive lives. Making gains in these areas and then actually developing policy recommendations and implementing a plan can help our region in promoting justice. And it's our job to come up with that. Our challenge collectively is to build on community strengths and the resilience and determination of families who aspire to be happy, productive, healthy individuals and to live happy, productive, and healthy lives in thriving communities. We can invest in and support a very different trajectory for our children. Those who are nurtured and given opportunity from birth, and those who languish in the system for early missteps or systemic bias. It is a trajectory that is built on fairness and hope for a future and captures the dreams and imaginations of what could be. And I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't add that in the context of a national moment where we are seeing national leaders tell people to go home based on, or to another country based on the color of their skin, it is more emphatically up to us than it has ever been before, and I want to prove that we can do the right thing here. So thank you to the University of Pittsburgh School of Education and the Center for Urban Education for hosting this event and your leadership in addressing this issue. We are truly happy to be engaged in a partnership with you, and especially thank you to everyone in this room for being here and for the work that you're going to do afterwards to make this happen. Thank you.
I think sometimes it's futile to ask what a person's motives are directly. I think a simple review of their work and the choices that they make is a clear indication of what their intentions are. And in the form of Dr. Dancy, when he came to Pittsburgh and he came to the center, we didn't have to ask what his intentions were. When he hosted reading groups with graduate students, when he would have writing retreats with graduate students and assemble scholars from different universities to come and just sit and engage one another, we knew what his intentions were. When he brought a certain amount and a certain type of speaker to the center, we knew what his intentions were. When he writes and you read his scholarship, you understand what his intentions are. And when you see what's happened here today, he stepped into a role where our previous director was highly celebrated, but he came in with a fresh vision of what could be, and he is, by all accounts, taking that momentum and moving it forward in a way that we have not yet seen before. And so I ask you to welcome Dr. Elon Dancy to the podium.
Okay, so by round of applause, how excited are you for this year's CUESEF? A little bit. Good. Good morning, I'm Elon, Dancy, and I'm humbled to serve in two roles which require thoughtful responsibility at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm the Helen S. Faison Professor, a distinction which honors the generous contributions of Dr. Helen S. Faison, who was a trailblazing education professional in Pittsburgh. She was one of the first black teachers in the Pittsburgh Public School District, and both the first woman and black person to hold the position of high school principal and deputy superintendent. The second role is Director of the Center for Urban Education, or CUE. The Center for Urban Education mantra is to learn, share, and transform, and essential to this vision are experiences of marginalized, dispossessed, and vulnerable populations who are primary concerns of the center's research, teaching, and service projects. Before I review some logistics and share announcements, I want to offer my observations about the significance of our gathering. We gather today on the land placed by its creator in the care and protection of several native tribes that camped and moved through what is known as Pittsburgh. We gather on land originally shared by many indigenous nations as a place of gathering and exchange. We remember the mound-building Adena tribe who constructed earthen mounds in what is known as McKee's Rocks. We remember the Hopewell tribe that came next, followed by the Monongahela, who lived here until the early 17th century. We gather on land that received the Delaware, Shawnees, Iroquois, when they were forced from their homeland in what is known as eastern Pennsylvania. And we thank the Seneca tribe for their care of the rivers before Europeans fought over who owned them. We gather amid possible sundown neighborhoods, trees that bore strange fruit, and stations on the Underground Railroad. We recognize life in a context forged through the political, economic, and life plunder of a black state. We gather in a city seen through Teenie Harris's eyes, spoken on Margaret Malayon's tongue, and dripped from August Wilson's ink pen. We gather at a university. Human slavery, writes Craig Stephen Wilder, was the precondition for the rise of higher education in the Americas. And we gather to confront various ways the horrors of enslavement recompose and reenact themselves in the forms of American schools and schooling. This point, this idea, speaks to an urgency in research and practice I have identified in my own scholarship. We gather at the invitation from the Pitt Center for Urban Education team, which over the last year organized their activities under the theme Reimagining Urban Education, Place, Space, and People. This year provided several opportunities to think deeply and critically about who and what constitutes urban education concerns. CUESEF is a fitting closure for this theme, as here we ask that you reimagine policies, practices, and politics in education systems and how this ultimately requires remaking the worlds in which these reside. While our conference theme does draw upon the more visible framework of the school-to-prison pipeline, we heed the words of Erica Miners, who writes that linkages between schools and prisons are less a pipeline and more a persistent nexus or a web of intertwined punitive threads. As Damien Sojourner writes, we have to resituate our understanding of schools away from a model that funnels students into some other structure and begin to look at how schools themselves are a locus of contestation. In other words, the history of education within American schools has been one in which, like prisons, countless lives, particularly black and brown ones, have been enclosed, managed, and terrorized. Therefore, we must grapple with the deeper knowledge that what may actually need to be dismantled are the school systems that reflect an eroding commitment to education in favor of punishment. This is the first of 3 days that we intend to have serious conversations about what we can and must do about the relationship of schools and prisons. And it is likely that in many of these conversations about policies and practices, it may be hard to tell where schools end and prisons begin. While I have the floor, I want to take the time to tell you why this is a special CUESEF. First, this is a national dialogue. Many of our speakers and audience are from all over the country. They have descended upon Pittsburgh as a rich site for thinking and work. In organizing the forum, however, we still center focus and concern on Pittsburgh issues, and we hope at the end to have a better understanding of how Pittsburgh data is situated in the country. Second, this CUESEF draws upon the power of dialogue across our lived experiences. Participants are teacher practitioners, activists, artists, parents, scholars, thinkers, school principals, school district leaders, university faculty and staff, and other actors. Our featured panels reflect our values of co-constructing knowledge and talking across thinkers on our platform and in the audience. Third, for the first time, the Heinz Foundation has provided CUE with targeted resources to shape a national forum that aligns with the Foundation's priorities, and we are grateful. There are 3 kinds of breakout sessions in addition to our featured panels: research discussions, practice and development workshops, and community dialogues. As many of our registrants are teacher practitioners and education administrators, we have identified tracks to support you in getting the most value from this forum. If you have your programs, see the legend in the bottom right-hand corner of the schedule. While we believe all the sessions are useful, teacher practitioners may want to consider completing the track marked by the dark square, while education administrators may want to consider completing the track marked by the dark circle. Another value in this year's forum is the pleasure principle, not the Janet Jackson song, but the importance of pleasure as a human and collective need. You should have a program insert or flyer. The message is also rotating on our screens. And you are invited to attend 2 social events Friday evening, which are off-site. Meet us at 7 p.m. at Spirit Lodge for an early reception, and then an after party at the Spirit Clubhouse. Saturday, following this forum, you are invited to attend an art exhibit, Race and Revolution, Still Separate, Still Unequal, at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. Admission is free. So we've aimed to be a gift that keeps on giving. Many of you have mobile devices. This is good. Our former Twitter hashtag is hashtag CUESEF 2019. If you hear something you find profound, tweet that hashtag so we can engage your words. Our Twitter site is @PittCue. That's @PittCue. If you're not signed up to receive announcements from us, you should be. So go to q.pitt.edu and click on the contact link to subscribe to our mailing list. This provides you with information about our future events, initiatives, and opportunities. Let me take the time to thank our dean who is with us, or was with us, for her visionary leadership. Let me take the time to thank the Center for Urban Education team. If you're here with us, some of us are out of the room, but if you're in here with us, would you please stand and be recognized? The faculty, staff, and students who I get to work with in the center every day. Thank you. We're grateful for our volunteers who come from far and wide in yellow shirts, and our very special gratitude to our event planner, Fantasy Zellers of Bounce Limited. Finally, thanks to all of you for attending. On behalf of the center, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Dancy. So, are you all ready for our first panel discussion? I have the honor of introducing Clint Smith. I'll read just a bit about Clint. Clint is a writer, a teacher, and a doctoral candidate at Harvard University. He's a recipient of fellowships from the Art for Justice Fund, Cave Canem, and the Callaloo Creative Writing Workshop. He joins us, and he will be moderating our first panel. And as he comes forward, he will introduce our other panelists. And so I invite you to please give him a round of applause as he comes forward.
How's everybody doing? I am thrilled to be here. Excuse me. And rather than reading the entire bios of the folks that we have coming up, I'll just say a little bit about what they've meant to me personally and how this is a really exciting opportunity, because I started graduate school the same week that Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson. And so my entire graduate school experience was animated by this sense, by this sort of backdrop of the movement for Black lives, and a recognition that it was impossible to disentangle my scholarship and my work from what was happening in Ferguson and increasingly across the country. And during my first year of graduate school, I found myself increasingly disillusioned by some of the things that we were spending our time reading and thinking about, and it was many scholars, including these three, whose work sort of regrounded me and reminded me of the stakes of this work, reminded me of the urgency of this work, and showed me provided a different model for what scholarly inquiry and advocacy and work on behalf of communities that we care about could look like. And so before I ever had the pleasure of meeting them, I watched them on YouTube, I followed them on social media, I just like fanboyed whenever I saw them. I tried to every conference they were speaking at, I tried to get the live stream. And so this is truly an honor for me to be someone who gets to sit among heroes in many ways. And so I'm very grateful for Mariame, David, and Carla for being here. And I know that we have a limited amount of time, so I want to have us hop right in and also make sure that we provide time for you all to answer or ask some questions at the end. And so, Mariame, I thought we could start with you, and we've had this conversation previously in different iterations, and I'm wondering if you can, because this is a panel on restorative justice, I think it would be helpful to sort of ground ourselves in a sort of common collective understanding of what restorative justice is and how you understand what that is, because I think people sort of sometimes misunderstand what the tenets of restorative justice are, and you two can feel free to hop in.
Great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm so happy to be here, and if the mic works, it'll be even better, I think. Yeah. All right. Everybody can hear me, right? Great. Awesome. So yeah, thanks for having me here. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to everybody who showed up here at 9 a.m. I wouldn't be here myself because I don't do anything early if I didn't have to be on the panel. So I'm really, really like so happy that you all showed up this morning. I also want to say that I'm in the middle of dental issues. I'm doing like a series of dental surgeries, so I hope that you can hear me as I'm speaking. So Clint asks about the tenets of restorative justice. Our panel is focused on that and how RJ could be useful in trying to address the school to prison pipeline. To me, at bottom, really what RJ is not a program. And what we know to be the case is that often in these days, a lot of people treat it as a program and then wonder why stuff hasn't magically disappeared or behavior hasn't transformed overnight or XYZ kind of thing has not occurred, and then get discouraged and want to try to move on to some new silver bullet that is supposed to be a panacea for issues that are at their root about many other social forces which combine to give you outcomes in schools that may be negative, right? So I think about it as a community-based practice to heal and to repair harm. Just a community-based practice to heal and to repair harm. I also, the way that people have kind of framed RJ is that RJ was an indigenous kind of practice or a framework or an ideology, and then it was co-opted in some way by the West, and now it's I don't know what. That's actually not the story. The story is that indigenous people have their way of addressing harm, their own framework, their own indigenous practices, the ways in which their ways, right, of trying to address harm. And in the 1970s, in the Western context, somebody who many of you may have heard of, a man named Howard Zehr, decided that he was seeing the rise of the criminal punishment system, the punitiveness of it, and what he thought was going to be something that will not actually lead to the results that we had been hoping for. So he realized that that system was asking a set of questions that were the wrong questions in his opinion. So when a harm occurred, they asked kind of, what rules were broken? Yeah, what rules were broken, what laws were broken? And then they asked, who's to blame, right? And then the other question was, how much pain are we going to administer to the person who broke the rules? That was the kind of the mindset of this, and it was leading to more and more and more of a kind of mass movement, a mass punishment system, a mass criminalization system. So Howard Zare said, actually, when relationships are broken between people because of harm that occurs, we should ask a set of other questions. And his set was, now we talk about it all the time, as what happened? Like, what actually happened here, right? And getting a lot of people's perspectives about what happened. And who has been harmed, right? Who's actually been harmed? You know, the current criminal punishment system does not really care who's been harmed. It really doesn't. And so Howard Zare was like, who's been harmed? And then what are the needs that emerge from those harms? What are the needs? What are the obligations as a result of the harm that occurred? And then the third question was, whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So that those questions replaced the other three questions that I mentioned at the beginning, and that became the basis of a set of core values that people who do RJ practices hold, which is that our relationships matter, that when relationships of harm, we're all less safe, and that as a result of that, we all, as a community, need to come together to repair the harm that was caused. And that the state, basically, right, the government, had stolen our ability to resolve our own conflicts. That is a model and way of thinking by a philosopher named Niels Christie, who wrote a piece called Conflict is Property. And he basically talks about the fact that the state stole our ability to be able to actually resolve our own conflicts. So created policing and all these other apparatuses that then took outside of our community the things that we need most, which are the skills to be able to resolve conflicts ourselves. So every time you hear a school call somebody from the outside to come and fix what's on the inside, that's us outsourcing our ability to resolve conflict to other folks. So what you need to be able to do in a community, which a school is figure out how the hell you're going to resolve your own goddamn conflicts. And why do you keep calling outsiders who know not the children, not the context, and not you to resolve something that you all have a responsibility to resolve? Yeah? Very important. So that is the basis of restorative justice work, if you're really taking it seriously and you don't think it's a one-time program where a kid sits in a circle and other people pass some talking stick, and then at the end of the process, everything's solved. Right. That's crazy. Because some of you have children in this room. How would that work at home? It would not. You all know it, but then you come into new contexts and all of a sudden you forget all the stuff that you already knew. And I think that's a real issue. So that's basically the basis of what RJ should be. Yeah.
All right. And thinking about that, Carla, in your work, you've written a lot about the way that young people understand these systems and the sort of ways that young people perceive the way that these systems are outsourced and how they are perceived within this sort of myopic state-sanctioned conception of what justice look like. And there's something you've written that I thought spoke very eloquently to this. It's when young people think that their lives will be governed by fair treatment when interacting with authority figures, they are likely to accept even negative outcomes. When youth confronted by unjust practices fail to perceive injustice, but also fail to succeed, they understand their failure to be personal instead of perceiving race, class, and other social factors as key contributors to social inequality. And that was, as someone who's a former high school teacher, that was something that I found consistently in the young people that I worked with, that they weren't given a sense of the sort of larger historical, social, and political phenomena that were shaping how their school looked, how their classroom looked, how their communities looked, and thus were in some way being stripped of a sort of agency that allowed them to understand that it was not in fact them who were the problem, but it was in fact a much larger set of circumstances. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yes, I think it's so critical. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a beautiful room. It's so beautiful to think about each of you being brokers and helping people navigate to education instead of incarceration. I think a sociological imagination has to be ignited in everyone, and it's so beautiful to hear Mariame open this up, and knowing that we shared time at Northwestern in the social department as students, and then
Are you admitting that out loud?
Because you're a sociologist. Come on, Come on.
Sorry, y'all.
So in igniting this sociological imagination, you remove this locus on one's individual actions and behaviors, and you let them see how they're situated within a larger context of a structure like a school and the neighborhood and the state and all of these different levels. And I think particularly for young people in high school, as they are at the point where paths diverge and where they are pushed out and moved on to different trajectories in their lives, I think it's so critical for them to understand it. And so when I went to speak with young people, I didn't go to them and say, how do you feel about this substandard education? A few projects I've had to knock down, like, do not go ask the people who are recipients of substandard education how they feel about it. No, that is not your role. Instead, I asked them, what is your voice? What can you tell me about your experience? What do you see working? What connections are you making to what you're learning and to what you see in the outside world? And as a sociologist, my responsibility was to take those voices, experiences, perceptions, and really root them in the context of where these people were and sort of how I could see the stories coming together of the Black kid who stays on the south side of Chicago, and their comparative frame was, well, the police stop everyone, don't they? In comparison to one who might leave the south side, go downtown, see the police waving and stopping and talking and chatting to people on the Magnificent Mile, and it's beautiful, and then they come back to their communities wondering, what, they don't come here. And they don't come here when we need them, so why do we even have them? And so this is so critical in thinking about moving, and here's another language thing, from this idea of procedural justice. Like, it's very tepid in terms of what we're thinking about. And you say, was the officer fair when they stopped you? And you say, you shouldn't have been stopping me. So how do we understand the sort of reality of interactions and engagements that probably should not have happened versus having a measure of whether or not, oh, were they polite to you when they told you why they stopped you? No, it's a bad stop. Don't stop anyone. So we really have to remove what I call in my book the universal carceral apparatus, all of these ways that school resource officers are there because the relationship between teachers and the students are broken. When my book came out, it was when the young girl was violently arrested in her classroom in South Carolina, and it really brought up that most people didn't know that police are in schools in that manner. It really showed us that that teacher didn't know what was going on in that young girl's life, and then how it could escalate to the principal, and then to the arresting officer, and then to the nation and the national conversation where people didn't think it was a problem. And so that's why I'm so glad we're here, where we can turn the lens on the systems instead of putting more focus on the individuals who live in an unfair and unjust system. And we have to change the systems.
Thank you so much for that. And yeah. And Dave, so much of your work is centered on ensuring that we don't understand contemporary phenomena in a vacuum, right? That we don't understand, or we don't operate under the sort of ahistorical fallacy that so much of what we're seeing right now is new, is original, is somehow un-American, or has come out of nowhere. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of historical through lines and underpinnings you see that have brought us to this moment in which we have this relationship between schools and prisons in the way that we do.
Definitely. Thank y'all. And thanks again to the organizers for having me, because I know you didn't have to, right? I think the thing, and thanks so much, probably me cuffing. Yeah, that's an MC problem, right? Well, Clint, thank you for that, because I think this is always the thing that we are tragically inept and we tragically refuse, right? So to hell with 45 Cheeto that y'all call Donald Trump, right? He's not the issue. He's a distraction. What we have to understand is America is just showing us what it has always been. Some of y'all didn't believe it. That's the issue, right? So this is what it's always been. This is a place, like Dr. Dancy put out, This is a place founded on genocide, wrongful land appropriation, and slavery. Let's be clear. And because we're so fearful of that, because we won't engage young folks with that, we repeat the same things in this form of cognitive dissonance, right? We refuse this. We refuse to engage that here in Pittsburgh, built on a rock, right? That no less than 6 nations were wrongfully removed, right? You got Three Rivers Stadium not because of the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? So this thing around how we even understand this particular relationship, and I think this becomes important because our ahistoricism justifies what Mariame and Carla put forward, right? Our inability to connect that to a real history, right? When we talk about convict leasing, when we talk about this thing around, and back to Miriam's point around when we even talk about restorative justice, we haven't asked the question around what are we restoring young folks to, right? It just becomes programmatic. So now when we start to think about that particular history, and I think I would encourage folk, if you haven't already, to read a book by James Anderson called The Education of Blacks in the South. And it's important to note, and he looks at places throughout the South, and actually some places in the North that William Watkins picks up in a book called The White Architects of Black Education, that any attempt by black folks to self-determine was met vehemently by white supremacy. Every county in the state of Mississippi has a recording of a school being burned. Every county in Alabama has a recording of a school being burned, right? And remember, public education as we know it had already excluded black folks, right? In its genesis. So this thing around the attempt for black folks, people of color, Latinx folks, indigenous folks to educate themselves has always been met vehemently by white supremacy, right? Either structurally, directly, or in terms of a covert set of actions. So this thing around looking at the current moment, it's not something new, or it's not something, because that's another thing that we do at schools. Schools are centered around the crisis moment, right? It's always around the crisis. Oh, somebody called a whole name. We need a whole school meeting. Right? Somebody wrote something in the bathroom. We need a whole school meeting, right? And now what we haven't done is saying, well, how do we, and ask this question, how do we actually accept or reject the logics of white supremacy, right? In our day-to-day understandings of the school, right? Because the school is based in a logic of white supremacy. Every other group who is not Western European, Christian, able-bodied, cisgendered male is othered. So now, if we look at this, and this is how we justify lying in school, right? The lie is age appropriateness, right? You don't want to tell kindergartners the Columbus story because you don't think it's age appropriate, right? And the issue is if a young person is old enough to experience degradation, isolation, and a carceral state, like my guy Lawrence Tan, who's from LA, talks about, then they're old enough to be engaged with accurate information. I think our ahistoricism is deeply rooted in fear, right? But the fear is young people taking control of their conditions, young people demanding something else, right? Because, and I'll end with this, all of us fear the kindergarten revolution, right? Because this is what it is. Think about it. You won on 35. What if all 35 of those young bloods instantaneously say, hell no? What are you going to do? Absolutely nothing, right? Because all you can do is get about 7 of them, right? And that's the 7 that you can get in your arm's reach. Man, it's 27 other young bloods, right? And they're gonna do stuff. And I think this thing around the fear of young people assessing the condition and taking control of it is what fuels the carcerality in schools, right? And we haven't looked at this historically, and it even makes us revisit stuff like Brown, right? The Brown decision is actually a wrong interpretation of the court, right? People were not arguing to sit next to white kids, right? People were arguing for an equitable distribution of resources that they had already paid for, right? So this thing around really understanding that particular context, I think, takes us away from the crisis of this shock of the current moment because we can see it as celluloid imagery. But I think this thing around, it is only a continuum of what we have always known and seen in schools.
I do think, though, sorry, yeah, please come forward. I do want to jump in just for a second to talk about, history is, also the kind of an infinite succession of presents, right? Like the moment, as Howard Zinn tells us, right? Like we're making our future through the current moment that we're in. So I think I want to speak for a second about ahistoricalness, if that's a word, in the romanticization of the school as a unit of analysis. I want to say that schools alone, and we're talking about the kind of prison industrial complex and the carceral state here on this panel, that schools alone can't stem the kind of nation's material and ideological commitment to the carceral state. What was the James Traub piece in the New York Times years ago, What No School Can Do? I think it's so important for us to talk about here because a lot of the pressure does get put on the school to address all issues. And yet, when we talk about a school-to-prison pipeline, that kind of obscures the ways, it's not really a pipeline, and it was mentioned by Professor Dancy earlier. It's more like a swamp that has connections to many forms of other things that impact the school and that the school impacts. And so what I think we have to honestly say is that the school can only do so much. And that there needs to be a whole system-wide, cultural-wide piece of work that's occurring to uproot punishment mindset. Because you're a teacher, you grew up in the world, your parents raised you. Most of us internalize a punishment mindset. That's like a human thing. When something happens, we immediately jump to how the hell are we gonna get back at this person? Revenge is an incredibly deeply kind of rooted aspect of human relationships. And to then go to school and act like that shit's gone is nuts. That too is a problem. That too is ahistorical. And so I really feel like if we are in a position, I love this quote that I found in a book that I'm reading by Carla called Troublemakers. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. I appreciate her a great deal. Here's the thing she says. She says, if the way we manage our classroom is a curriculum or a set of lessons young people are learning from us, what are we teaching now? And what might we want to teach instead? I think about that a lot because it's a key restorative question, right? That classroom management is itself a curriculum. You all are teaching young people how to relate to you and how to relate to each other. And if that curriculum that you're using is super punitive and yelling at people, that's how those young people are going to relate to each other and to you. To be shocked that they're going to be disrespectful to you when you're disrespectful to them is nuts. I mean, of course. They are going to do what you do back, right? And even if they don't do it, they're thinking about doing it. And that itself is also a manifestation of something different. So I really think it's really important to think about what lessons we're teaching through the doing of things within institutions that are not just the school. We keep doing that over and over again, and then we're like, yeah, it's like nothing's being learned. Lots of things are being learned without having been, quote, formally taught. And you all know this. But I think it's important for us to raise that up in our conversations, particularly around restorative practices, because the punishment mindset is so strong.
And Miriam, can we go there and really kind of get into this super quick? But I think this is the kind of the thing that, to your point, becomes critical, especially for folks who are working in schoolhouses. The wrong assumption is that schools are naturally good. right? And we have to go there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I mean, like I think this is what is, we have to take it there,
It's the
right?
romanticization of the school.
And dare we say,
Yeah.
we are willing to engage something like a school abolition, right? And I think this becomes important. This is you all's work and your work in particular, Mariame, in terms of school largely is order and compliance, right? Education may be asking questions as to why that order and compliance exists, right? And if we are talking, if an abolitionist perspective is abolishing the conditions that put us in a particular predicament, and if we know school is one of those particular predicaments, are we really willing to engage in something like a school abolitionist? Now, teachers here are probably like, hell, what is he talking about, right? But hear me on this point. We know that every attempt by people of color in the United States to educate themselves, has been met with a vehement response by the white supremacist state. Every attempt to do that type of work is often forgotten because there were places like freedom schools who asked 3 particular questions that we are no longer willing to engage. They said, what does white society have that we want? What does white society have that we do not want? What are we willing to do to create for ourselves on our own terms, to educate ourselves on our own terms? So Bettina Love talks about an abolitionist teaching, right? Are you prepared to go into your classroom and every day fight the constructs that govern what you should be doing? And are you willing to engage a space from this abolitionist perspective that says what I engage young people with is also my own attempt to thwart those systems that oppress while creating something anew?
But wait a minute. I'm as someone who studies schools and believes in them, I also want to push back and say, shouldn't we be transforming our idea of what school is? Because as a Mississippian, as a 3rd generation alumna of Pineywood School, one of those schools started in 1909 by a black PhD who said, I'm going to teach the children of formerly enslaved people how to read and, you know, really get this going. So this, I've seen the kind of illustration of what schools should be, to know what I see may be wrong in an unequal city like Pittsburgh or Chicago or New York City even. And so shouldn't we be changing our conception of what school is to say what we're doing now that is, you know, totally traumatic is not what school is, instead of abolishing school?
No, well, the thing is, I wouldn't call those places schools.
Okay, so you're not, okay.
Right, because I mean, I think about in terms of, because I think about school as this structure, right? This thing that we're supposed to plug into to supposedly have this outcome. But what it actually does is to teach you to hate yourself and to love whiteness, right? So this thing around, and what I mean by that, it's a place that it is engineered for you to hate yourself. Right? And you are graded, assessed, largely on how well you demonstrate how well you hate yourself. Right? And Piney Woods did not have that.
Okay.
Right?
So is Piney Woods a school or is it not a school?
Right. And do we call it, but can we, in our imaginary, in our radical imaginary, call those places something different?
Okay.
Right? So like when we started a school in Chicago, our first name for it was going to be the Che Lumumba Institute of Revolutionary Practice in Education.
Okay. All right.
So we and then one of the homies was like, nah, bruh, you in CPS, right?
Okay.
But this thing around, but it's the radical imaginary of saying, no, that when folks made an attempt to self-determine, I wouldn't call that a school, right? I think about school more in the logic of white supremacy. I think about school more in the logic of the prison, right? These are spaces largely to contain, right? Give you all another example. How many folks would say they had a good teacher? Now, I want you all to think about those folks. How many of those good teachers were always in trouble? Those are abolitionists.
Okay.
Right? They have engaged in a practice that they care less about the school and more about your education. Right? And those are two different things that I think about if we are thinking about this radical imaginary. What do we call those spaces that we're engaging young folks to change their conditions?
Because I would say we stop calling the schools that are damaging schools, and then we, elevate the model of the ones that are. But I hear the critique and I understand it. But I also want to think about why it is in this particular country and in the structure that school is the only site. We have given up on changing communities and neighborhoods, and we've given up on what we're doing. So it's really the last place before you get to that next place where I'm studying in New York City, the juvenile court, where they're saying, oh, I could give you a higher level charge so you could get more counseling. Or, as a condition of this punishment, you're getting the social service you need, but you couldn't get it at what was supposed to be a school. And so how do we think about elevating the places that really are doing the things they're supposed to do, and why schools became this only site of, fulfillment of these ideals, particularly Brown and everything else, because we neglected the communities, the neighborhoods, and the people who lived in them.
You want to say something, but I do think it makes sense to talk about freedom centers. What we want is freedom centers. And what I mean by that, freedom forces you to use your imagination and be creative and have intuition, all the things we need in order to transform conditions. Currently, the way in which we think we teach people how to be good at critique and analysis, and that's really important. But what often that can be also is immobilizing and paralyzing, because it doesn't give you that sense of the possibility of transformation and change necessarily. You can get stuck on critiquing and analyzing, and that makes you a spectator, rather than an actor, an engaged person, somebody who has to be contributing to the transformation of the conditions in order for us to make a move to the next space. So I think freedom-making centers, whatever we want to call it, will engage us to think differently. But I do think schools are here. People are conditioned to think about schools. We're going to have to work in schools, we do. We're going to have to work with schools in order to make those kinds of transitions over to something else. I do think we need an otherwise world, and that's really important in our ability to be able to get liberation, to be free.
And I'm wondering, building off on this, schools are here, they exist, and the people in this room are teachers, school administrators, and are interested, clearly, in what it means to bring a restorative framework to their schools, to their institutions. And we've talked a little bit about how schools are built on an idea that runs counter to restoration, and in many ways runs counter to education. And I'm wondering, do you think, so oftentimes, and Mariame, you alluded to this, but schools, or restorative justice is brought into schools and used as a substitution for suspension or expulsion or detention to varying degrees of success, we'll say. And I'm wondering if you think that, so what does it look like, and this is for all of you, what does it look like to bring restorative justice into spaces that were founded on the antithesis of restoration? And does it require, on a sort of logistics level, a sort of wholesale reimagination of like what the central operating functions of school discipline, quote unquote, are? Or can it be done with, do you need new human capital? Do you need new spaces? Do you need, or is it something that can exist within a classroom, within what would otherwise be detention, or so to speak? Does that make sense?
Have you all who've been in schools for a long time know that when I used to teach in Harlem years and years ago, the I was a very young person when I walked into, I should not have been teaching anybody. I was like 2 years older than my students. You know, it was a big mess. But, and they never taught you at, school how to teach people how to read. It was a nightmare. But I did get along with my students and they liked me. You know, those were helpful things, but I was a terrible teacher. But one of the things that I think about is in every school that you walk into, there is at least one teacher within that school who seems to have her classroom on a complete glide path, right? Those students they're behaving, they are working, they are doing shit, and then they go to other classrooms and they are a hot mess, right? You all know, and we all know who those teachers are. And, okay, we know who those teachers are. I will tell you that most of those teachers are practicing restorative. They're doing restorative work. Those students know when they come into class what they're supposed to be doing. They have a routine. They have a structure. They have a place to put their grievances within a particular context. They know that these are the classrooms where when conflict happens, the students handle it amongst themselves. The teacher may not even know the conflict occurred. All you know is that the students are working it out. Right? How are those people able to do that within very oppressive systems? Within schools that are seen as disadvantaged and problematic and whatever. So it's clearly possible in whatever settings we are to be able to have skills that allow us to be able to manage conflicts in productive ways, address harm in non-punitive ways, and help people heal from that harm. You can do that anywhere, okay? The issue is then you're just the one classroom that's doing it within a sea of mess. And that's a problem because those students only get it in that space. And when they go elsewhere, it's a cognitive dissonance situation because they're in a complete, like, what is happening here? So you have to really think about relationship skills and structure. All three have to be at play if you're gonna have a truly restorative practice in a school. And it's a paradigm shift and a cultural shift. I want to say the last thing is that often it's the adult relationships in building that are most dysfunctional.
Well,
they are. The adult relationships among the staff. Look, we used to run a peace room at a school on the far north side of Chicago, my organization, Project NIA. We were there for 2.5 years. We ran this peace room, and what we noticed was that the teachers needed to be in the peace room more than the students did. Because they were stressed out, things were happening, it was hard, and they were then projecting that onto their students, and their students were projecting it back. The teachers were in conflict with each other and hated each other. They hated the administration. The parents were disrespected. The parents would come in there only to be belligerent and yell at people. It's the adults who are a hot mess, and then the students are learning from that hot messness how to be with each other. So I am like, restorative justice should not be a student program. It needs to be a cultural transition shift for the fucking adults in the building. Excuse my language. Really, I mean, sitting in those spaces, I'm like, people need help. They need help to be able to know how to manage their own relationships with each other. So every single time we try to outsource our conflict to other places and try to disassociate ourselves from the very spaces in which we're not in right alignment or in right relationship with each other. And what restorative justice at its bottom is being in right relationship with each other. So schools have to do that in very, very specific ways, and it's possible to do. Absolutely. Absolutely, I've seen it. I've seen it in the best places, the best schools. They know how to do that. And
just before you hop in, Dave, because these are, folks on the ground who are probably like, all right, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? I want to do this in my school. I know we're talking a little bit about pushing back against outsourcing, but in your experience, when schools want to have these sort of wholesale cultural recalibrations, do you have administration go to a training and then implement those practices themselves? Can you outsource that type of thing to have people who are professionals at this come in for professional development? And
there's a very practical way to do this, right? So like in colleges of education, this is the bullshit we put y'all on, right? We always talk about pedagogy, but we never want to say what the hell it is. We got hella pedagogical discussions, but nobody knows what the hell it is, right? And then we answer a question, well, pedagogically speaking. Right? That's how we mess with y'all, right? So this thing on the ground, because Clint, I think this is key. On the ground, for all the administrators in the room, I want you to think about something in particular, right? For the administrators, when you all were teachers, you knew when you went to that professional development, you knew that shit was not going to work with your students. You know that, but we still comply with that. We still go to those mind-numbing PDs that are killing everybody in the PD. And we say, well, that's not gonna work. And then when they come and do their walkthroughs, you gotta show how you're doing the mind-numbing killing exercise. You can step in front of that. You can step in front of that by saying to the district, and be explicit. Be explicit with your explanation as to why that won't work for your young folks, right? You gotta step in front of that, right? And you can step in front of that. And there are examples of folks. In Chicago, they don't even tell you this. You can opt out of the PDs, the district level PDs, if you decide to run them. So at Social Justice High School, we opted out of all the PDs and we ran them ourselves. But that requires you taking hold of what is happening in the schoolhouse. So now you're no longer working with the crisis moment, and like what Mariame said, that those teachers who know what they're doing, they need to be leading the PDs. Because if they are not...
And pay them to do it.
Exactly, because if they're... Exactly.
Pay them
right?
to do it.
It's that simple. Because those are the folks who operate in isolation in the schoolhouse, right? Who all the young folks respect, but y'all don't like because the young folks respect them, right? So I think about that piece very practically, right? Suspend those district level PDs that you know are not going to work in the first place. Empower the folks in the building to say, we know what we're doing, and here are the places where we can actually engage. Principals who operate fugitively do this all the time, right? And notice the words we're using, right? Abolition, fugitivity, right? We're saying that we know these places are not necessarily built for us, but we're here. So now that we're here, we're going to be clear about what rules work for us and what ones we need to break, right? And I think the other part of this is thinking about, once you have made a decision to defend the justice condition, it is never about if they are coming for you. It is when they are coming for you. So you just gotta be prepared when they walk through the door. So when they come through, they walk through and they got their pens and pads looking crazy and shit, and then they go to the next room, and then all the young folks like, who are these weirdos? And then they doing all of them. You can say, I would crack a joke with my high schools. I said, look, when the feds come, just remember I'm on page 48. And if they take me, and I'm going for longer than 3 hours, I'm in a process of extreme rendition. You know who to call, okay. Right? So when people come through in the walkthroughs, the first thing they say, Stovall, is that them? You good? But that thing around, because we're talking about relationship building, but those practical ways to build relationships is for people to see that you know what the setup is, right? And you have to be willing to stand in front of that setup. I work with a principal named Rito Martinez who said, look, this is my job as a principal, to keep CPS off your back so you can do what you need to do with our babies. Period. My job is to keep CPS at the door, right? And then he also said another thing. He said the most operative answer you ever offer to central office, and it's a permanent answer. Anytime central office says something that you need to do, the first thing you say is no. But understand that no is a contingent answer. It is not an answer of refusal. It is an answer that is directing you as to what you're going to do next. So now you're saying, this isn't going to work. But what we will do is this, right?
Can I jump in? I mean, I think there are two ways where Mariame has said you can see those classrooms, and I think we've gotten too comfortable with seeing schools and internal stratification with the tracking and the gifted programs and all these other things, or that magical one teacher, that we really have to say, how do we make this the entire climate of the school, not the exception, but the rule? And how that works is for the principal to be on board with really shifting those norms. I did a visit at a school just south of Chicago a few months ago, because I'm going earlier now. High school's too late. I'm going earlier now to think about these conditions. And the principal wouldn't let me see the 2 second-grade classrooms I wanted to compare. He only would let me see one, and as I walked down the hallway, and I said, oh, that must be the other one, because he was leading me to the one that had been the special education sort of throwaway classroom that I was asked to come in and observe with my notepad. And the principal said, I'm going to observe it with you. I mean, it was so problematic, but I instantly knew, like, oh, there's the other classroom. I could just see it as I walked through. So we have to be clear that there should not be such internal stratification and quality teaching experience within schools. It's not okay, because you know the shifts of children who are going to those other rooms versus the ones who are not. And this parent who asked me to come in, her child had been in the kind of gifted track, but unspoken up until 2nd grade. And then she said, wait a minute, something is wrong, because they put her child in the other room. So we have to make sure we, equalize and uplift and elevate across the space. I've also seen the model as an outsider sociologist coming into a charter school where I was asked by, not quite the dean of discipline, but someone adjacent to say, come in and just talk to us. And I said, okay. Once people started talking, I was like, this particular person who rides the elevator with the children up to the school on the 12th floor, they're a problem. Oh, I see the dean has issues. So I got in that room for 2 hours, and I could figure out who the actors were, who had conflict, where the issues were, who should not be teaching, who should be teaching the people to be teaching. And it was just amazing, and I, maybe can train people to do that, but it was just 2 hours where I went in and was able to say, as an outsider, here's what you need to work on, and this is what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing. And the principal was in the room, and I said, whatever you do with this, it's on you, but you have brought these people together, and now you have to do something. So I've seen the kind of insider, nonchalance about the stratification, and also being able to come in and say, you need a fresh eye, and this is, this has to be disrupted, and there are ways to do it. And I got a wonderful sort of note from the principal, as well as from some of the teachers, saying we're having conversations we never would have had you not gotten us in that room to speak the truth about the things that were not great, and to talk about what we could do to replace it. So, I mean, it was an amazing moment, but you have to figure out how to do that at the school level for certain people to come in.
And Clint, just real quick, let me sound crazy for a second.
Wait, Clint doesn't get to ask any questions in this conversation.
No, it's fine.
Is that all right?
The best
the
panel.
The moderator is being asked
No,
out.
the best panel is the type where you don't have to say anything. So.
Because Stovall will let you
I was just
going to
say that clearly one of the takeaways from this panel is that you should hire Carla to come into your school, and hire all of them.
I'll train some grad students to do it. I can't go everywhere.
Something super quick, y'all, and this may sound crazy to some of you all. What if we put joy into our assessments? Right? And that thing around, so how do you assess joy? What would it mean to ask teachers, how are you bringing joy to your classroom, right? As a pedagogical question, right? That's a process question, right? How are you bringing joy to your classroom, right? And this thing around who assesses that joy? Not you in terms of students will be able to in the unit plan, but literally, when we turn the table and our students ask different sets of questions of us, and when you ask them, are you feeling joyful in this class, we fear the answer. So now this thing around really thinking about how can we really incorporate joy, because assess is the wrong word, But how do we now start to think about that, right? I was working with a group of young folks, and they had an agenda, and then they stopped, and the last point of the agenda was just joy in big, bold lettering, right? And what is that demand for joy? And some of you all have had this, you know, when I was in a 5th grade classroom, they had a party every Friday. You want to understand classroom discipline? Have a party for your young folks every Friday. They will take care of everything for the rest of the week. Because how they talking to each other? They like, bro, look, you understand what Friday is? Come on, man, quit playing. We got to do stuff, right? So this thing around how, and really think about that, because when we get into this kind of didactic space around what should be done, we automatically sacrifice joy, where joy should actually be our first understanding of what it is that we're trying to do.
I do think one thing, though, about the how, because I know people, I'm like a concrete, like I need to have steps, and, you know, in order to figure out myself, and I can imagine there are people in the room who are in that position as well. And I want to say, so I made a short film called A Different Kind of Safety. That was focused, and it's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's really short. The thing I appreciate, the reason I did it was because it was in the process when Obama was talking about more money into schools for cops, when one of the mass shootings had occurred, and we were immediately starting to push back and saying the resources should go to the places where you actually want to see the thing grow. Like, you know, like you don't want to see cops grow, so why are you putting more resources there? You do want to see ability to be able to manage conflict without punishment and without cops grow, so why isn't any money going there? But this particular school that we feature is a school that was within a school. It's a school within a big building, 2 schools. And this is in a neighborhood on the west side of Chicago with the same kids. One school has metal detectors and cops at the door in the same building. The other school has no metal detectors, no cops in the building. Same kids walking through the different 2 doors in the same building with completely different visions. What were they doing? At the school that we are featuring in the film, they have this thing called Days of Peace. They do training where they have a group of students apply every year, and they take them to Rhode Island for a Kingian nonviolence training set of resources, and they also learn how to do peacemaking circles and keeping. They independently raise money for this every single year as a school district. They're a public school. They raise money to send these young people, 10 of them or 15 of them, to go and learn these skills, and then they expect these students to be part of the process of managing the school during the course of the year. Those students are the ones that other students go and seek out when conflict occurs. They don't go to the principal. They know who to go to, and it's their peers. So it's a high school, so you know most of the people who get trained are juniors. So everybody goes to those particular young people. Everybody knows to do that. That wasn't like some magic solution. That was a bunch of grown people sitting together and being like, how are we going to handle this? We don't want cops in our schools, and we don't want metal detectors. And spending time decolonizing themselves and getting the cops out of their heads and hearts. Because the question is always for me, the adults talk about safety all the time, and they're the most unsafe people. They're the people the young people want to go to less. The ones screaming the hardest about safety are the ones who are the least safe people. No one will go to them for shelter in the crisis. Now ask yourself that question. You're yelling out there about the fact that you need more cops, more punishment, more whatever. The students are avoiding you like the plague. That tells you something. You are not a safe person. And I don't want to hear from people about how all these kids are wild and can't be controlled if in the same school, two doors, one door with no metal detectors, in the same goddamn community, with the young people being the same poverty rate, same race. How's that possible? That was a paradigm shift and a culture shift that came from the top. That was the administration and the teachers getting together and saying, we don't want this for our school. This is the values we want for our school. We are going to work as hard as, when you come into the school as a new teacher in that place, you are inculcated not in pedagogical shit. You are inculcated in the values of that school. And if you can't hack it, they will not have you the next year. If they catch you yelling at children and the children come back and say, this person yells at us all, you will not be renewed. Why? Because the person who runs that school is a former priest who talks about the peace dividends. The fact that you actually can find a dividends in investment in peace, that is a ripple effect that you cannot get from punishment. And everybody agrees, because everybody knows John Haran. They know that's his value. He believes this thing like it's his religion. And other people are willing to come along on the ride. And really, if you're not, then you got to go somewhere else. That's also important. Being part of inclusive relationships means having strong boundaries that allow you to be able to tell people when they don't belong here. You're not saying you need to go outside of the community altogether. You're just saying you can't stay here.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, we're not, quote, people always talk about disposability. Part of non-punishment mindset is not disposing of people. That's bullshit. It's not that disposing of people means that you're kicking them out and casting them out as outcasts. Telling somebody they can't be here because they don't subscribe to your values is just good judgment. It means that you can actually build a culture that you need in order to hold people accountable. So that they hold space for people so they can take accountability, because you don't really hold anybody accountable. So I think those are the important things that we really have to do. And because it's being done other places, tells us that it's possible to do. And that the lie, in fact, is that these children that are in these schools are so damaged and so not possibly able to interact, because we see them that way for a reason that's beyond the school, that these children don't belong in spaces like that. I went to a school in New York City that was a private school that had no police, no metal detectors, a bunch of kids coming in doing drugs, smoking drugs, doing all sorts of shit because they had money. And how were issues resolved? Guess what? In a very restorative way. Because those parents were not going to have it for their children to have the cops called on them, because that was going to mess up their college applications and their futures. So the principal had to find alternative ways of talking to Johnny. So I don't believe this bullshit when people say that you cannot imagine an abolitionist future. People are living that present right now, all over the country. The difference is why my kids can't have that same future, living in this present. Why can't my nephew have that same opportunity as the one that you want very desperately for your children? So Johnny gets a talking to by the judge, if he sees a judge. Right. Well, I know, but I'm saying, gets a talking to from the principal. Whereas Tyrone immediately gets the cops called on him because we've outsourced our conflict to the police. I think we have to think these things through, and the fact is, it's like we can do this work. You all do it, by the way, every day in your own houses. Your kid comes home, drunk, shit's gone down. The first thing you do is not dial 911, I promise you. Right. I promise you that's not the first thing you do, and it's not your thought process. Your thought process is, how the hell are we going to make sure that this doesn't happen again? Or we're going to get resources in the house so that Johnny doesn't come home drunk every day. Or I'm going to call your Uncle Jim, and Uncle Jim's going to talk to you. Something else. We have multiple options that we can come up with to keep our kids from being entangled in the system. You know how to do this, people. Why is it that you won't do it for other children? You know how to do it.
So, just this will be the last quick piece before we move to questions, because I know that questions are sort of bubbling up here. But last thing, and you kind of just answer it quickly, I'm thinking about the sort of sociological praxis of understanding that, as we've talked about for the past hour, that schools do not exist in a vacuum. They are part of a larger social, historical, political ecosystem. And we have to instill practices in our classrooms and our schools that recognize that. I'm wondering, for teachers and for administrators, so often we feel like we can only control what's happening in the school. But as we've talked about, if something's happening in one classroom and then isn't happening in the next, that creates a cognitive dissonance that's difficult for students, difficult for teachers. In many ways, our students, even if that's happening in an entire school, that they move from the school into the community, in which that has a history of hypersegregation, that doesn't have social services, that doesn't have mental health hospitals, that doesn't have X, Y, Z, go on and on. So how do teachers recognize that cognitive dissonance, even if it doesn't exist in a micro context from classroom to classroom, that it exists in a sort of larger structural context, going from even the best schools in the country back into these communities that have been historically underserved. How can teachers think about what it means to create some semblance of, or to advocate on behalf of, or to think about what their role as educators in mitigating that cognitive dissonance to the extent that they can? Like, what does that look like?
I think there's something that comes up, and there's a teacher, a longtime teacher in Chicago by the name of John Yolich. In fact, Clint, he reminds me of you. And John would always say, when we are engaging with young folks in classroom spaces, and we see something that is could be assumed to be disorderly, that could assumed to be out of pocket, he said the first thing you have to say is, it is not the student, it is the condition. How do we actually find out what that condition is, right? And I think that's always the thing, right? Because this is always, when you talk about discipline, right, it is a punitive discipline all the time in school space, right? And we always think about order and structure. Well, not even structure, but order, right? And order is a lot more of the compliance, right? So you're sitting down, or you're looking ahead, or how they doing KIP, you gotta do this thing, and they do this thing, and they say you tracking, no hatred to the KIP folks, but y'all know what y'all do, right? And you gotta track your teacher, right? I mean, all this stuff is just reminiscent of the slave state, right? And what we have to start to think about is, because schools are not in a vacuum, we have to now think about how are we understanding where it is that we are teaching and who it is that we are teaching, and not from a deficit perspective. We have to be clear that there are a certain set of conditions that are connected historically to particular places, and that our students are no less smarter than anyone else on the planet. But what we have to be clear about is now there is some attention that needs to be paid to those particular conditions. And I always think about this because in other spaces, we don't have a concept of how to address displacement, right? And the trauma that comes with displacement, right? And when you see it, like here in Pittsburgh, you all have seen schools be depopulated. You've seen Carnegie Mellon take over neighborhoods, right? Right, I gotta talk about it. I get on the plane tonight, so I ain't worried too tough, right? So, but this thing around really understanding that place, and I think when we start to really understand that it's not the student, right? It is the response to that particular condition. And now when we understand what those conditions are, now we have, and as teachers, one of the things that we have to say is, we have to be very clear as to what we do not know. And if we do not know these things, then how do we get folks in tune with the folks who do know, right? And not as passing it off, but now saying, if that person who does know, now I have to work in concert with them to develop what it is. Because a lot of times we just pass folks off. That's what folks are talking about when we pass people off into the RJ program, right? But instead of saying, well, what is it that I need to know so that we can address this in the best way that we can? And I think that becomes important, because in too many ways, we think about the behavior in a classroom as absent and not connected to the conditions in our neighborhoods, right? And I always understand those things as one and the same, right? And when we can't put that in context, we often do the worst by young folks.
Blocks away
I would just say uproot your own punishment mindset and help your students to do the same. I think if you start there, there's a lot that's possible and that can be done. I think the second thing I would say is teach the cognitive dissonance. The young people in your space need to be able to reconcile the difference between the way they may feel in school, if it's a good school and they feel safe and protected and held, with the way they may feel outside of school that is not that. So teach the cognitive dissonance. Create students who are going to be basically active parts of transforming the conditions that we need. If you yourself are not that person, make a whole bunch of those 30 students into some of those people. 15 of those students being out in the world and fighting in the streets is a testament to the work you will have done for your life. I mean, I can't tell you how many times when I see former students of mine out in the streets during the last 5 years, taking action in the world, there's no bigger pride in my life than that. Because I know that they not only are thinking about the world critically, they're also imagining a different otherwise. That is the utmost part of teaching. That is what the reward is, right? Because it's not money. So I think that those things are really, really important, and that makes a difference. And, you know, that's how we're going to change the world, is creating a whole bunch of other people who will change it if we can't individually ourselves.
There you go. So we're going to transition to questions from the audience now. I think we got about 15 minutes, so please make sure your questions are quick. Please, please, I know it can be, if I heard them speak, I would want to tell them my life story and tell them how much I love them and be like, Lil Johnny told me this and I said that, but like maybe after or maybe not during the break. So please be quick so that we can have as many questions as possible. Please make sure it's a question, and I think they're walking around with microphones. Are there microphones available? There were, there might be. In the meantime, if you want to just stand up and maybe speak loudly until we get the microphones, go ahead.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you to everybody on the panel. You guys were phenomenal, so I'm just going to give you another round of applause. Thank you. So many different things about how schools are, and I was really feeling you. I mean, and I like the way that you explained how you have a teacher who is doing all the right things, but they're always in trouble. And that helped you understand where this young man was coming from. That was definitely huge. And you were saying a lot of great things as well. But as someone who's been in education and for a long time, one of the things that I know that we all learn in, quote, teacher school was Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And it seems as if once we get to school, when we get into the classroom, that's totally thrown out the window. So when you talk about the condition, it's like, why aren't we talking about those things? If we could get the kids, we always want the kids to get to self-actualization, but we don't want to help them build that foundation. So I know you guys were talking about that a little bit more, but when I'm thinking about the foundation now is why don't we start with the youngest of all of our students? You know, because typically we start with high school, and I know we started going down middle school and second grade. What about kindergarten? What about pre-K? Can we start talking about that and start working our way up? Because that's the foundation. Because by the time, if you get them at 5, you can really do some work. But if you get them at 15, it's going to be much more challenging. So I just wanted to know what you guys thought about that.
Well, let's say something quick about Maslow, right? Does anybody know the relationship between Maslow and the Blackfoot Nation? Maslow stole the hierarchy of needs from the Blackfoot Nation, right? And in his notes, he talks about how he actually came to look at self-actualization by way of observing Blackfoot restorative practices, right? So anytime we start to think about that, first we got to get into how this colonization really works, right? So this thing around, and to your point, this is actually, and I would make this argument, pre-K or pre-K through 3 teachers do some things in their classrooms that we always forget, right? And I think the thing that always is reminded, that I'm reminded by K through 3, pre-K through 3 teachers, is the ability to learn collectively, right? And the ability to assist each other when someone is in distress, right? And I actually got a chance to see this at a high school, but they got it from pre-K teachers. There was a young person who was reading, and they were having a little trouble reading this particular document. Their teacher said, all right, everybody, show her some love. All 30 students got up and surrounded her. And I'm standing next to him, and I'm saying, and they're saying to her, are you okay? We don't have to do this if you don't want to. We love you, right? And I'm like, and one of the teachers is a good friend, and I'm like, Judy, how did you get young folks to do that? And she said, well, first, I had to acknowledge where I got that from. I got that from a preschool. And once we hit 3rd grade, the love just stops, right? And the testing starts, right? So this thing around really thinking about when we start to return to understanding collective ways of learning, right? And assisting others in stress. And one other quick point, please, let's miss all the trauma-informed care, right? And I want to say this, right? Because we have wrongly assumed trauma to be pathological. It is not, right? Trauma is a result of a condition, of a situation where you felt you had no control over. It is not pathological. It is not inherent to black and brown bodies. And I think when we talk about little ones, that's where they want to start, right? In opposed to their capacities to engage each other collectively and to address each other when someone is in distress, right? And I think that those spaces we have to start with, right? It's not about the end point being when they're in high school about to enter post-secondary, but it's literally those foundational things that pre-K through 3 teachers already do, but everybody else is instructed to forget, right? And I think really it's around understanding that process before we start to dismiss, what we can do with young folks.
I want to hop to next question.
Yeah, that would be me. First of all, I'd like to commend the panel and thank you. And David, it's always great to hear you. I heard you earlier in Indianapolis at the Lumina Ash workshop. But I have a question that's really more student-centered. I did teach elementary school in Compton Unified School District. So I have been in a district that, shall I put it, needed quite a bit of change. I would like you to address as a panel students' expectations, school as community, classroom as community, and what are students' expectations? Because for many students today, the school is their community. And what is the expectation? And also, I was sitting here thinking about African nations. In some of the African nations, such as Tanzania, it's seamless. Parents decide upon the discipline in the schools, and the school is a community resource. So I'm asking you to say a little bit about what are the students' expectations starting from kindergarten on up, in terms of what their community, their classroom should look like as a community, and what their learning experiences should be. And our teachers asking them what their expectations are. I don't believe in classroom management. That concept is problematic for me, so.
Thank you for the question. As someone who takes students' ideas and voices very seriously, I will say maybe we shouldn't have started off the conference like we're going to hear from young people. So I do want to, open up that space that will come for them to speak about, how their expectations are met. But one of the things from my research in Chicago with 9th and 10th graders was they can answer these questions about what their expectations are, what their aspirations are, what the school should be like, but then they also know that's depressed by the reality of what it is. And what is so heartbreaking is when that mismatch or that gap in expectations and reality is just taken for granted, and our young people know that. And so we really have to acknowledge that this is the condition This is their perception of it. This has been their experience, and then figure out what we're going to do to change it. So it's very clear, and I think we have to work on the diminishment of those possibilities and how we really invigorate not only one's expectations, but also the realities of what schools should be. So I can't wait to hear from the young people who are going to talk in this room. Thank you.
Any more questions? One over here.
Hi. I would like to, all your information was great, but I would like to know if anyone on the panel has ever gone inside a juvenile detention center and evaluated the school processes and the type of education that goes on inside there. I taught inside a juvenile detention center for 12 years. And when you talk about the teacher who was always in trouble, that was me, okay? My peers hated me, but that was okay because I was not there for them, okay? But right now, the struggle, it's a lot of misunderstanding, and most of the kids who come in there come from conditions. And when you don't understand the condition and everything that's done to you and for you is punitive, your attitude of learning turns negative. And while you're there, then they're setting you up, writing you up, tracking you, and documenting everything that you do. So I just want to know if anybody here has taken a look at that and where they're talking about imagining policies and practices for dismantling. Someone needs to do research inside those schools. Education is going on, but it's not the type. My main question to my peers before retirement was this: would you have to change the way that you teach if your own child was sitting in your classroom?
You're doing research in those spaces. I have run for many years programs within juvenile detention centers. We ran a program called Girl Talk at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, which was a volunteer-led, volunteer-run program for several years of volunteers who would go inside to the juvenile detention center and offer three things: show movies with the girls that were in there, do an art project with them, and do a writing project with them during the course. We did it every 2 weeks for many, many years within the space. So I've spent a lot of time within those spaces. One of the Nancy Jefferson School, which is within that particular space, is also one that we've partnered with, particularly the librarian over there, and we would bring in projects and programs. Dr. Amanda Klonsky has done research specifically about kids that are educated within prisons and juvenile detention centers. I think her dissertation was about that, so that might be something you might be interested in reading and looking at. I think it's kind of I find it particularly poignant that we have schools and prisons, given the fact that a lot of the kids, most of them who end up there, were pushed out of their home schools and into these prison schools, which are often incredibly not just punitive, but soul deadening for those students. So that when they leave the space, they hate school even more than when they came in. And that just, to me, is just heartbreaking. And the fact that you were there for 12 years, I just want to say thank you for putting in that time and for caring about those children and being there and fighting on their behalf, because there's such a need for them to have advocates. They have so few advocates, so thank you for that.
And I'll say two other books. One is by Jerry Flores, Caught Up, and another, Alexandra Cox, Trapped in a Vice, would be two books to read about really getting the nuance of the situation. And I think for, having these schools in New York City, you've seen the, close of so many juvenile detention facilities, and I really want us to put ourselves out of a job of educating young people in prisons. And I was at a conference a few months ago where an educator said, we have to break down the walls and bring more college students into the prisons, and we have to make them into schools. And I was like, no, we have to make the schools into schools first, and then we won't need this. And so I have had the heartbreaking experience of being at a commencement ceremony for a GED program in a correctional facility and seeing these people there who did not get the education they deserved before they showed up in the prison. And so you say, what could you have been had you been given the true education you needed? And we really can't shore up the prison offerings when we haven't done what we should be doing in the community and in those freedom centers or whatever we're going to call these schools. I can't wait to figure it out. But thank you for the work. And we really don't get enough people coming in because they don't want us to see those horrible conditions. And it's already on Front Street with what we're doing in the actual school. So we have to wholesale change it.
I think we have time for one more quick question, and we'll just have one person respond if anybody has. I think we got one here. This way.
Thank you. So I guess this is the last question, so I'll try to make it a short one. So I work as a district level administrator in Pittsburgh Public Schools. I've been there for 4 years. I absolutely love my job. I've had the opportunity to work in maybe 15 of the schools of the 54 in that 4-year time period. My focus is typically special education, but really that's much bigger. It's everything before and everything that comes during and everything that comes after. And so I'm thinking at a systems level, right? This is what's up here on the board, and you guys talked a lot about the individual classrooms and individual schools. I'm curious, where have you seen the systems change, right? So we're not talking about just a building, but the entire system, which would include the community, the administrators in the main building, the superintendent, the school board of directors who ultimately make those decisions and determinations for what's gonna happen and what comes down.
Well, there's some hope in Chicago. Chicago has never had a locally elected school board since the establishment of the city in 1833. It is the only district in the state of Illinois without a locally elected school board. And 4 of the 7 appointed school board members this year with the new mayor is now working to eliminate an appointed school board and to transition to an elected school board, right? And that's the first, and this is part of years of struggle to make that happen. Another place in San Francisco, and now with all the problems in San Francisco in terms of housing, it's important to put this into context, but the city of San Francisco has actually changed up its assessment. So each school is assessed on how they demonstrate support of students' self-determination, knowledge of self, and collaborative work, right? Now that's a citywide assessment, right? In terms of looking at, so this systems-wide change, but I wouldn't say, the thing I would say, I would not want folks to get high on those particular changes, right? Because systems were never created to destroy themselves. Systems are created to perpetuate power. So now, when we think about this work, do we still have to think about systems work fugitively, right? Because when it shows up, those folks will still make the argument around deficit, around pathology, around those spaces. And can we build out space to actually make sure that we're doing right by the folks that we care about and sharing that with other folks, right? And I think that becomes more important because, people talk about non-reformist reforms, but it's really around talking about asking a deeper question of what we're in. And if we ask a deeper question of what we're in, then we also have to ask a question of how do we break free, right? And I think that's a important space because if freedom is what we're looking towards, then the system may not be able to provide that. And we have to be willing to say when it can't, right? And I think that becomes important when we do our work. And still, how can we support that freedom regardless of our occupation? And what will we do because these are the folks that we care about?
Please give a round of applause to our panel.
We are off to a phenomenal start. And before I offer any other instructions, would you like to close out with any remarks, Clint, as our moderator? Something you'd like to? I'll publicly put you on the spot, but you're capable.
No, I mean, I think, honestly, so much has been said. I wish I was up here taking notes, but I think the thing that is most generative, I've been to many of these conferences, and I think it can be very easy to kind of just like listen to the panel, listen to the breakout, take notes, and keep your head down and keep it moving. But the most generative piece of this experience is exchanging with your colleagues, like truly. And I think sometimes it's awkward, like, I don't know you, we haven't met before, but to the extent to which you can, whether it be during break or whether during lunch, exchange ideas, your reflections with the people at your table, with the people that you just met, those are where the sort of most, that's where the wheels really start turning, and those are where the connections are made as well. Because as we've kind of talked about the last hour and a half, like, this is a communal effort. This is a collective effort. And if you feel like you are doing this alone, if you feel like you don't have a space or a person or place to go to look for resources, to go to look for advice, to go to look for connections and assistance, then it can feel increasingly solitary. But you're here because you're in a room full of, a couple hundred people who share the same values and share the same goals for building a better world for our students. So please take advantage of that.
Thank you. Let's thank our panelists once again, please. So, just a bit of housekeeping. We do have 3 sessions that are here. So to my right, Alumni Hall 121, out these doors and to my right. And the other 2 sessions are in the Wyndham. And if you leave to my left and just walk down this sidewalk, it's a faster route to get to where you need to be there. Again, we are off to a phenomenal start. We have to understand that what we're looking at is not just a pipeline. It's a funnel of systems and things and people and operations that then lead to our children's placement into prison and other judicial-focused places. It's comprehensive. It's about community. It's also revolutionary, and it's also disruptive. So as you move forward throughout the rest of the day, keep these things in mind, and we look forward to seeing you where you need to be at 11 a.m. Okay? Thank you.